Hi guys. So the good news is I've not yet passed out from this costume. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the second part of this review. So in the last video, we talked about the founding of colonies in the Chesapeake and in New England. Now we're going to transition over and we're going to talk about the rest of the colonies in British North America. A group of colonies we call the Restoration colonies, and then Georgia, which is its own weird thing. And we'll get to why it's its own weird thing. So we are going to flip over and I'm going to get you guys some images. And we are going to start talking about the next part of period two. And again, we're still in that 1607 to 1754 time period. We're just dealing with another wave of settlement within North America. So most of the colonies that we talked about in our last video were founded in the early 1600s. Beginning in the 1640s, settlement stops. And that is because something occurs in England. During this period, England is ruled by this guy, Charles I. Charles I doesn't really like the way England has traditionally limited its monarchy. So the British have actually instituted a limited monarchy going all the way back into the Middle Ages when they forced the king to sign the Magna Carta. What the Magna Carta basically says is that no one is above the law, not even the king, and that the king can only level taxes on people if he calls parliament and gets their approval. This is wildly different from the rest of Europe. Now, from the 1200s all the way up to the time of Charles I in the 1600s, every monarch has signed and agreed to that document. But Charles doesn't. Charles is living at a time when monarchs like Louis XIV of France are claiming absolute authority. And they claim that this authority has been given to them by God. They're using what in European history we call the divine right of kings, that kings are given divine power by God to rule their subjects and do whatever they want. So Charles wants to be a absolute monarch. He doesn't want parliament around, and he doesn't care for their cutting off or taking away any of his power. This will ultimately end with him in Parliament having a bit of a war over who is going to actually control England. It's known as the English Civil War. Unfortunately, the English Civil War doesn't quite go the way Charles wanted it to go. Charles loses the war, and then he loses his head. And then there's a period of time in which England experiments with being something akin to a republic. End of that time period, though, the English are sitting around and they're like, wow, we really miss having a king. This whole experiment with republicanism of a type is not really for us. We really miss having a king. And they start looking around. They're like, who could be our king? And then they realize Charles actually had a son, also named Charles. And so they send an invitation. He's hiding out in England. They sent hiding out in France, and they send an invitation over to France, and they're like, Charles, so we totally killed your dad, and we're really sorry about that now. Would you like to come back to England and be our king? And our friend Charles says yes. He has been waiting for this moment. And so we call this period the Restoration because the monarchy is being restored in England. So everything that happens in the reign of Charles II is known as the Restoration. We're restoring the monarchy. Now, as Charles looks around, there are people who supported him when no one else would, supported him while he is away in England, not having any away from England. And so he wants to do something for these people. And then he has a bright idea. He decides he's going to give them land in North America. He's going to set up colonies for these people to administer, which seems like a great idea. You supported this man when he was in exile. Now he is giving you profitable land in North America. So the colonies that are founded during this period, we call those the Restoration colonies because they are founded during the restoration of the British monarchy. And so these colonies give us the places like East and West Jersey. which will eventually, the proprietors of it will decide it's too small and they'll combine it together to form New Jersey. We'll also get Carolina out of this, which will eventually be found to be too big to be one colony, will be cut in half and will become North and South Carolina. These colonies are proprietary colonies, meaning that the people they are given to get to do kind of whatever they want with this land, settle it, and reap the profits themselves. None of these particular colonies were given to single individuals. These were actually given to groups of people whose job it is to administer them. Now, there is a restoration colony, though, that is given to a single individual person. And that is going to be the colony of Pennsylvania. And so, if you remember, Pennsylvania is actually founded by a guy named William Penn. Penn's father had given loans and money to Charles I, Charles II's father. So, Charles II wants to reward the Penn family. And so he goes to William Penn and he says, what can I do for you? What will help you and your family? Penn has an idea. Penn is a member of a very small Protestant sect of Christianity and one that is not really well understood in its own time. He belongs to a church known as the Society of Friends, though you may have heard them referred to as the Quakers, which is another name for them. Quakers are poorly understood in their own time and are often unfairly maligned. They believed that each and every person was made by God and that a part of God resides within them. And so, as a result of that, they believe that harming other people is a sin. So, they're pacifist, which in societies that have large armies and tend to make war, Quakers aren't super popular. They go a little further than that. They say that because of this, people are equal in the sight of God. So they tend to be anti slavery advocates, which in and of itself at that time is not a major problem. The thing that really gets them into trouble and super makes Puritans' heads explode is that they go a step further and they argue that women are equal to men, that women were also made in God's image, that the spark of the divine resides in them, and as a result, there's no particularly good reason to cut women off from services within the church or from holding any sorts of offices. Women have the same capacity and deserve the same dignity and respect as a man because they have also been created by God. This is the thing that really blows people out of the water during this time period because Quakers actually allow women to speak and preach in their churches. Something that Puritans and the Church of England, no other Protestant sect is allowing that, and the Catholics definitely aren't allowing it either. Early conservative Christianity actually has traditionally taken a very dim view of women. And so when the Quakers say women are equal and deserving of dignity and respect, that's actually pretty foreign in Christian theology. And that has led to Quakers living in England being heavily persecuted. Now, Penn is a Quaker. So he asked the king to give him some land in North America where he and other Quakers can go and live in peace and not be killed by other Christians. So the king agrees and gives him land, which he names Pennsylvania. That means Penn's Woods. And Penn and the Quakers go there and settle. Now, that does not last a particularly long time because some of the Quakers begin to point out that they're all equal in society. So, how come William Penn and his family get to be in charge? Yeah, I know, right? It's great. And eventually, the whole government collapses. It becomes a royal colony. And unfortunately, William Penn dies a pauper as a result of all of his attempts to pour money into this colony and make it successful. Also, during this period, England is going to snag a colony from the Dutch. They are going to snag New Amsterdam. The king, Charles, gives it to his brother, James, the Duke of York, as a gift. If your sibling is not defeating a foreign country and getting you a colony as a gift, do they even love you? But in gratitude for this, our friend James renames this colony after himself and calls it New York, as he was, in fact, the Duke of York. At this point, colonization stops. England has 12 perfectly good colonies that they are perfectly happy with right now. England found another colony until the 18th century, until the 1730s, and that's Georgia. So Georgia is the last colony that Britain founds in North America. And it's also kind of unusual. It has a very different story for how it gets there. Georgia's story starts with this guy. This is General James Edward Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was something of a reformer and a humanitarian in his own time. He was a member of parliament. And he knows that England has some issues. And one of the issues that England is having as it's becoming an industrial society in the 1700s is that there are a lot of poor people in England, a lot of poor people. And the prevailing thought at this time period was if you're poor, if you're not doing well, that's a reflection on you. You're lazy, you're sinful, and nobody should help you because you became poor because it's your fault. You're lazy. Oglethorpe also subscribed to this belief all the way up until one of his childhood friends falls on hard times. This friend had been a successful architect, and then some personal illnesses and some illnesses in his family got him into debt. And as a result of this debt, he is thrown in prison. In England at this point, if you could not pay your bills, you ended up in a debtor's prison, and you were held there until you paid off your debts. Well, the problem with this is that if you're in prison, you can't work, which means you never get the money, which means your debts never get paid out, and you never get out of jail. In the case of this friend, he ends up dying in the prison of smallpox and neglect. When Oglethorpe hears that his childhood friend has died, he knows that his friend wasn't lazy. And that what happened to his friend happened through no fault of his own. It was some terrible life circumstances that came down on him. And so Oglethorpe uses his position as a member of parliament to launch an investigation. And he investigates the prison system and the debtor's prison system of England. And he comes back to parliament. The first thing he says, our prisons are horrifying, and across the board, we should make them more humane. And the second thing he comes out with is a revolutionary concept. He throws out the idea that some people are poor through no fault of their own. And he posits the idea that if a person falls on hard times, the government and society has a duty to help them. This is revolutionary at this time. This is the beginnings of the social welfare state in England, the beginnings of the idea that a government should help people who have fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. A society has a duty to help people who are trying to help themselves and can't. So Oglethorpe argues that these people are what he calls the deserving poor. They're not lazy. They want to work. And he goes to the king and he says, give me some land in the New World, and I'll prove to you that these people who do want to work will take them there. We will give them land. We will give them the means to support themselves, and they will support themselves. And they'll work a little bit on the side for us and give money back to the crown. Now, England decides this is actually a pretty good idea. Also, because they're the Spanish down in Florida and they're threatening South Carolina. And so Parliament says, well, if we plump a colony down between South Carolina and Florida, they'll act as a buffer. And Oglethorpe can try this out. Oglethorpe can prove to us that poor people deserve respect and help. So Oglethorpe is given the charter to found a colony which he calls Georgia after the king. He then quickly sets up a committee of trustees. These trustees create the bylaws of Georgia and how it's going to work. These trustees include members of parliament, other members of the government, philanthropists. There are women that sit on the board of the trustees, not just men. And they formulate up a code of laws for how they are going to run this colony. Some of these laws make a lot of sense. They ban things like hard liquor from Georgia. They also ban slavery from Georgia. Other things that they put out there make less sense in the long run. They ban Catholics, Jews, and lawyers from settling in Georgia. One of those things is not like the others. And if you're wondering why lawyers, British people loved suing each other. It was a national pastime in colonial America. So Oglethorpe argued if they didn't have any lawyers, people couldn't sue people. They could just concentrate on doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, one of these bans did not last a particularly long time in early Georgia, and it wasn't the ban on lawyers and Catholics. Pretty soon after settlement, Oglethorpe lifts the ban on Jews to allow a group of German Jews to settle in Savannah. So that part of the ban actually does not last very long, but lawyers and Catholics, they're a no-go for pretty much the entire time of Trustee Georgia. So Oglethorpe has gotten his colony, and he sets forth to settle it. He's going to settle its primary city on the banks of what we now call the Savannah River, and we call that city Savannah. Savannah is the first planned city in British North America. Literally, they went with a city plan of what this town was going to look like when it was finished. Collections of houses grouped around green spaces that would be shared areas. They would include whales for people to draw water from, places for them to graze their livestock if they had any. This city plan is actually still intact today if you visit Savannah. You can still see the original squares and streets laid out by Oglethorpe. Now, almost all of the colonial buildings are gone because Savannah has been ravaged by fire, but you can still see the original layout of the city. There is a myth that has been propagated since the 1930s that Georgia was, in fact, a penal colony. It wasn't. Australia was a penal colony. Georgia was never a penal colony. No prisoners were ever brought to Georgia. The people who were brought to Georgia were the deserving poor. They were catching the people who were about to go into a debtor's prison, and instead of sending them to a debtor's prison, diverting them over into this colony to work. Now, people had their own little plots of farmland, which they farmed on to support themselves, but they also owed labor to the trustees. This was how the trustees were making a bit of money on the side. Oglethorpe had decided that silk production was going to be how the people of Georgia make their money. Unfortunately, British peasants don't know a lot about silk production. They killed a lot of silkworms, never produced a ton of silk. So that ended up not being a particularly good way to run the colony. And while the trustees sort of proved their point that the poor they've transported do want to work, long term, the colony never turns a profit. It has financial trouble the entire time. And there are also high death rates in Georgia. Georgia just does not stabilize very quickly as a colony. As a result of this, Parliament is finally in the 1750s forced to dissolve the trustees and make Georgia a royal colony. When they do that, they lift all of those original bans placed on it, allowing slavery to come in, allowing lawyers in. With the introduction of slavery and plantation agriculture, Georgia actually stabilizes very quickly. What this also means is that most of those poor families, with the exception of literally two families, remain poor. They are quickly squeezed out by richer people from South Carolina moving in and buying up the good land to turn into plantations. So, in the short term, these people worked and they obtained some level of respectability. But in the long term, they end up losing all of this and becoming crazily poor again in Georgia. So, in the long run, Georgia was a failure, but it was largely a failure because enough money was not invested into it and there wasn't enough oversight of the rules and an ability to shift the rules as that became necessary. But we have now founded all 13 colonies. By 1754, there are 13 colonies in British North America. In our next video, we're going to spend some time talking about sort of the culture that has grown up in these colonies. What's it like to live in colonial America? What's it like to be a colonial American? What kinds of things do you do for fun? What kind of clothing do you wear? No, like this if you're a woman, provided that I have not passed out by the time we get to that video. So I will see you guys quickly in our next video.